Hello, welcome to Radical Engagements here at Barnblog, and we continue part 5 in our series of reading JudgeSabo's Read on Authority by, his critique of On Authority by Frederick Engels. We're now in the section called Capital is Present, the Authority of Revolution, part 1. Let's get this up on the screen for you. Long quote from Engels. Why do anti-authoritarians not confine themselves to crying out against political authority, the state? All socialists are agreed that the political state and when the political authority will disappear as a result of the oncoming social revolution. That is, that the public functions will lose their political character and we be transformed into simple administrative functions of watching over the true interests of society. The final two paragraphs, Engels discusses the idea of political authority. While Engels believed that socialism will retain authority in some forms, it does not retain authority in all forms. In particular, political authority, and therefore the state, will disappear in socialism. According to Engels, quote, all socialists agree on this point. It is questionable whether this was really true even when Engels wrote it. Was it true of Lassalle or Bernstein? Even among Engels' followers, and actually Bernstein was among Engels' followers, this does not seem to be well understood as Engels would have liked. Only a few decades later, the key Bolshevik leaders would lament how commonly the Marxists of the Second International would present themselves as statists in contrast to anarchists. Nikolai Bukharin notes this near the end of the start of his anti-anarchist paper, Anarchy and Scientific Communism, 1918. Quote, let's begin with our final objective and that of the anarchist. According to the way the problem is posed at present, communism and socialism presuppose the conservation of the state, whereas anarchy eliminates the state. Advocates of the state against the adversaries of the state, that is how the contrast between Marxists and anarchists is usually depicted. One was mechanized that the precision of the contrast is not the work of the anarchists alone. The social democrats are also very much to blame for it. Talk of the state of the future and the people's state have had widespread currency in the realm of ideas and phraseology of democracy. Furthermore, some social democratic parties always strive to lay special emphasis on their statist nature. The catchphrase of the Austrian social democracy used to be, we are the true representatives of the state. That sort of thinking was spread by others too, apart from the Austrian party. In a way, it is commonplace at the international level and still is to this day, insofar that old parties have not yet been thoroughly liquidated. And of course, this, quote, state learning has nothing to do with the revolutionary communist teaching of Marx, unquote. Yeah, I would say this is even worse now in the 21st century, post Bernie Sanders and post the USSR and post the PRC, than it is then. Bukharin also helped influence the views of Vladimir Lenin on the state, who argued a similar position in State Revolution, also agreeing with Anton Pannekoek against Kautsky. Quote, the proletariat needs a state. This is repeated by all opportunists, social chauvinists, and Kautskyites, who assure us that this is what Marx taught. But they forget to add that, in the first place, according to Marx, the proletariat only needs a state which is withering away, i.e., a state so constituted that it begins to wither away immediately and cannot but wither away. Quote, end quote. We see anarchists from the period lamenting how frequently the need to remind Marxists that they were supposed to be opposed to the state too. The Italian anarchist Luigi Fabbri writes in his response to Bukharin's Anarchy and Scientific Communism, 1922, scare quotes on scientific, quote, for some time neo-communist writers, and Bukharin especially among them, have been wont to accuse anarchists of a certain error, which the anarchists on the other hand have always denied, and of which until recent times could easily be laid at the door of the Social Democrats of the Second International, to wit, that of reducing the whole point of the issue between Marxism and anarchism to the question of the final objective of the abolition or non-abolition of the state in a socialist society of the future. At one time, democratic socialists who then, as communists do today, styled themselves as scientific, affirmed the need for the state and the socialist regime, and in doing so claimed to be Marxist. Until very recently, anarchist writers were more or less the only ones who opposed this sort of misrepresentation of Marxism. Now, on the other hand, an effort is underway to make them jointly responsible for that misrepresentation. Unquote. I mean, most anarchists today would accuse Marxists of being statist, and they would be right, but historically speaking, it's wrong. All right. It seems that Engels' theory of the state is not nearly as well understood as he believed, given, and it's worth elaborating on the point that Engels left implicit because he believed it to be already common knowledge. Engels believed that the state is a product of class conflict. In capitalism, the primary that primarily takes the form of conflict between capitalists and landlords against the proletariat, i.e., the wage workers. The capitalists and landlords have claimed ownership of the land and the means of production as their private property, which can only be worked with their permission. The proletariat are only extended this permission on the condition that, in addition to reproducing the value they consumed, they produce surplus value for capitalists and other exploiting classes. They, therefore, are forced to work longer and more intensely than they need, working for free for a large portion of the day. There is therefore an irreconcilable antagonism between these classes in terms of their economic interests, with the rulers trying to extend the exploitation as far as possible and the proletariat trying to eliminate it entirely. But because of these opposed interests, the subservient classes tend to rebel against this, seizing the means of production for themselves or taking action to reduce the exploitation and sabotage their interests of their rulers. To maintain this system of exploitation, the ruling classes need to resort to violence. The state is their organization for this purpose, violently enforcing their property claims, breaking strikes, or even claiming new property through the conquest or opening up new markets. This is a role of the state with its police, military, prisons, and so on. The state is therefore not a neutral institution, separate from the rest of society to enact blind and fair justice. It is an exercise of power over the masses that maintains the mode of production of that society. For the modern state, this is capitalism. This can clearly be seen in Engels' Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. As the state arose, long quote from Engels, as the state arose, the need to keep class antagonism in check, but also arose in the thick of the fight between the classes. It is normally the state of the most powerful, economically ruling class, by which its means become all the politically ruling classes and acquires a new means of breaking down and exploiting the oppressed classes. Because this is the true role of the state, it is also clear why Engels believes the state would disappear in socialism. The goal of socialism is the emancipation of the working classes and the abolition of class rule. In a classless society, there would be no purpose for the tool of class rule. Having lost its function, the state will disappear, whatever necessary functions it provided losing their political character. At first glance, it seems like Engels is in agreement with the anarchists, at least as far as the state is concerned. However, Engels believes their theories differ in at least one aspect covered in the next section, part 2. Quote from Engels: but the anti-authoritarians demand the political state be abolished with one stroke, and even before the social conditions that give birth to it have been destroyed. They demand that the first act of the social revolution shall be the abolition of authority, unquote. According to Engels' theory, if socialists wish to abolish the state, they need to focus on abolishing class distinctions. The state will disappear as a direct consequences of this and will die out or withers away, there being no need to abolish the state since it goes away on its own. The anarchists supposedly believe the reverse. They want to begin with the destruction of the state before class differences, i.e., social conditions that give birth to it. Engels describes this position as wanting to abolish the state in one stroke. Engels has made similar claims in other places, like in Anti-Düring, where he claims anarchists believe the states can be abolished out of hand or overnight. Engels thinks that anarchists have things fundamentally backwards. And we see this explicitly in the letter to Theodore Kuno regarding Bakunin that we analyzed earlier. Quote, quote from Engels: the great masses of the social democratic workers hold our view that the state power is nothing more than the organization with which the ruling classes, landlords and capitalists, having provided themselves in order to protect their social prerogatives. Bakunin maintains that the state, which has created the capital, and that the capitalist has its capital only by favor of the state, as therefore the state will be the chief evil. It is above all the state which must be done away with, and then capitalists will go to hell of it. And then capitalism will go to hell of itself. We, on the contrary, say do away with capital, the appropriation of the whole means of production in the hands of the few, and the state will fall away of itself. The difference is an essential one. Without a previous social revolution, the abolition of the state is nonsense. The abolition of capital is in and of itself a social revolution, and therefore a change in the whole method of production. And once again, months before On Authority was written, we see Engels going through the same lines of thinking. We see a parallel to assertion that all socialists agree with his theory of the state, emphasizing the great masses of social democratic workers hold our view. More importantly, we see Engels not only thinks of anarchists disagree with his theory, but essentially they have the reverse of his theory. Anarchists not only intend on abolishing the state, but do not intend on abolishing capitalism. Instead of saying that class antagonism are the cause of the state, they say that the state is the cause of class distinctions. And therefore, they have the opposite plan of achieving socialism, abolishing the state, and then allowing capital to wither away or go to hell of itself. After we completed an analysis of authority, we'll take a closer look at Bakunin's ideas to see if this is an accurate representation. Now, Bakunin's ideas to see if it's an accurate representation. As an obvious alternative that Engels does not consider here is that the state and capitalism are mutually reinforcing and therefore need to be abolished together. It seems natural to assume that any fight against capitalism would also necessarily involve a fight against its enforcers. Engels, for reasons excluding this through, might be found in the next section, though. Part 3, long quote from Engels. Have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? A revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. It is the act whereby one of the populations imposes its will upon the other by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannons. Authoritarian means, if there ever be at all. And if the victorious party does not want to have fought in vain, it must maintain this rule by means of the terror which it arms to inspire in the reactionists. Would the Paris Commune have lasted a single day if it had not made use of the authority of armed people against the bourgeois? Should we not, on contrary, reproach it for not having used it freely enough? Engels here tries to call anarchists out on a contradiction. On one hand, anarchists advocate for social revolution, while with abolishing the state as its first act. On the other, anarchists have denounced all forms of authority. The problem is that the revolution is the most authoritarian thing there is. It is an inherently violent affair where, quote, one part of the population imposes its will upon another part. This is necessarily an act of political authority exercised by the proletariat's own state. We therefore cannot consistently call for a revolution and denounce all authority. It is clear that in Engels' view, all violence is authoritarian no matter what its function it plays or what end it serves. This means alone, i.e. rifles, bayonets, and cannons, are what gives its authoritarian character no matter the context. I'm a little bit more sympathetic to Engels in this one. To assault someone is authoritarian, and the fight back against this is equally authoritarian. They are imposing their desire to hurt you, and by resisting, you are hurting them back and imposing your desire not to be hurt. Engels is clearly using a broader definition of authority than the third interpretation of impose presented around the start of the essay. We should keep in mind that he is not equating authority with violence either. As the majority of the essay demonstrated, he believes that there are nonviolent forms of authority, as in the factory. This would seem to bring up another interesting point rarely discussed. Engels appears to believe that anarchists are pacifists, or at least they would need to be pacifists to be consistent. This is actually a rather frequent way that Marx and Engels depict anarchism, especially discussing their call for abstentionism and the opposition to political parties. We can even see Marx's essay published alongside On Authority called Political Indifferentism. Marx, pretending to be an anarchist, presents their position like this. Quote, a political struggle of the working class assumes violent forms and the worker replaces the dictatorship of the bourgeois class with their own revolutionary dictatorship, then they are guilty of a terrible crime of laissez-principe. For, in order to satisfy the miserable, profane daily needs and to crush the resistance of the bourgeois class, they instead, laying down their arms and abolishing the state, give the state a revolutionary and transitory form. Ellipses. It cannot be denied that if the apostles of political indifferentism were to express themselves with such clarity, the working class would make short shrift of them and will resent being insulted by the doctrinaire bourgeois and displaced gentlemen, who are so stupid or so naive as to attempt to deny the working class any means of struggle. For all the arms to which to fight must be drawn from society, as it is the fatal conditions of the struggle have the misfortune of not being easily adopted to the idealistic fantasies of these doctors and social sciences have exalted as divinities, namely under the names of freedom, autonomy, and anarchy. Yeah, although I've always wondered this, because this is the opposite critique he makes of Bakunin. He actually accuses Bakunin of being overly authoritarian because of propaganda by the deed not being democratic enough. Marx clearly is filing a similar critique of Engels, such as with a similar style of mockery. The anarchist is a complete pacifist, stupid or naive, rejecting all violence, equally and expecting the state to be abolished simply by taking down their weapons. The rejection of a revolutionary dictatorship is equated with the rejection of any violent resistance by the working class against their exploiters. A similar point is made by Marx in a speech regarding the Hague Congress of the First International. Long quote from Marx. A group has been formed in our midst which advocates that the workers should abstain from political activity. We regard it as our duty to stress how dangerous and fatal we consider those principles to be for our cause. One day the worker will have to seize power, have to seize political supremacy to establish new organizations of labor. He would have to overthrow the old policy which supports all old institutions if he wants to escape the fate of early Christians who, neglecting and despising politics, never saw their kingdom on earth. Oh, I kind of think they did, Marx, to be fair. They took over the Roman Empire, after all. But we by no means claim that the means for achieving this goal were identical everywhere. We know that the institutions, customs, and traditions in different countries must be taken into account. We do not deny the existence of countries like America, England. And if we know your institutions better, we might add Holland, where workers might achieve the aims by peaceful means. That being true, we must admit that there are most countries on the continent, it is force that must be the lever of a revolution. It is force which we will have to be resorted to for the time in order to establish the workers. Asterisk. It's interesting that America and England are the areas where Marx thinks socialism can happen democratically, at least as implied by this letter. Marx here is addressing a call from the anarchists like Bakunin for abstaining from politics. Marx believes this is a direct rejection of revolution. While he admits that socialism might be achievable in some places without violence, like in the United States or England, he believed that most European countries would require the force found in revolution, which is equated but to establishing the rule of the workers. Once again, here we have an anarchist abstentionism equated with pacifism, which is countered by pointing to the need for violence to achieve socialism. When many modern readers see this passage, they assume that Engels is accusing the anarchists of contradicting themselves by calling for violence while claiming to reject authority. But from the evidence, it seems like the actual contradiction Engels has in mind is that the anarchists are calling for revolution while rejecting violence. This is a subtle distinction, but it is an important one for understanding how Engels views anarchism. This is why he increasingly asks, quote, have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? Only then explain in detail the need for violence. This also helps explain why Engels believes the anarchist view of the state is so backwards, or why they cannot support simultaneously opposing the state and capital. For Engels, the state is organized violent force fighting on behalf of any class, but they share a common feature of violence and therefore authority. Engels groups together exploiters' organizations dedicated to enforcing class rule and the workers' organizations dedicated to abolishing class rule under the name state or dictatorship. If the anarchists truly wish to organize a violent revolution, then Engels would consider this organization to be a state by another name. And so, it seems reading on authority, it is not clear that Engels maintained this position over time. Partly as a consequence of anarchist pressure, Engels later began to shift his terminology, denying that the worker state was really a state in the proper sense of the term, having the features that made it unique compared to other states, and like its tendency to wither away. This can be seen a few years later in a letter to August Babel regarding the draft of Critique of the Birthday Program. Quote, all the pablar about the state ought to be dropped, especially after the Paris Commune, which ceased to be a state in the true sense of the term. The people's state has been flung in our teeth ad nauseum by anarchists, although Marx's anti-Proudhon piece and after the Communist Manifesto declared outright that with the introduction of social sort of society, the state will dissolve itself and disappear. Now, since the state is merely a transitional institution of which the use is made in the struggle and revolution to keep down one's enemies by force, the other nonsense to speak of a free people state, so long as the proletariat will make use of the state, it makes use of it not for the purpose of freedom, but for keeping down its enemies, and as soon as there can be any question of freedom, the state would cease to exist. We would therefore suggest that the Gemeinwesen, commonality, be universally substituted for the state. It is a good old German word that can very well do the service for the French commune. We see here that Engels is basically the same theory of the state in mind, that the state is presented as an institution for, quote, keeping down one's enemies by force. And because the state has this role, Engels believes it is not, quote, used for the purpose of freedom. By this reasoning, a slave uprising, since the use of violence against its masters in order to free themselves, cannot be characterized as being used for the purpose of freedom. Even if Engels' theory is unchanged, though, He is refining the terminology here. He believes that the worker state should no longer be called a state, not only because he considers it to be rhetorically a losing battle against the anarchists, but because there is a real material distinction between the people state, which will dissolve itself and disappear, and a state in the true sense of the term. Lenin would later make a similar argument, denying that it is properly speaking to refer to the workers' revolutionary organization as a state. Part 4. Quote, therefore, one of either two things. Either the anti-authoritarians don't know what they're talking about, in which case they are creating nothing but confusion, or they do know, in which case they are betraying the moment of the proletariat. In either case, they serve reaction. Believing that he has caught the anarchists in contradiction and advocating for a position actively harmful to workers' emancipation, Engels says we have two alternatives. Either the anarchists do not know what they are doing, or they do. And if they do not, their confused ideas undermine the workers' movement. Not only are they incorrect about what sort of society the workers are fighting for in socialism, but they are also advocating against the workers using the best means for their disposal for doing it. And if they do, then we are all in the same situation, except now the anarchists could easily be seen as traitors instead of fools. Either way, they harm the movement and help the bourgeoisie, and thus concludes on authority. And this also concludes our discussion for today. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. You know the stuff behind the wall. Share and share alike. If you listen to our free podcast, either on Apple Music or Overcast or anything like that, feel free to review it. We're also available on Spotify, stuff like that. Rate it, review it. Have a great time. You can comment here if you want to comment, and make sure to check out the original essay that we're talking about today. Have a great day.